Hello everybody, this is Odd Job Entertainment bringing you another video. Now, destruction in video games is an oft-touted buzzword with a myriad of meanings depending on the game itself. It's a proverbial carrot dangled in front of gamers. We hear it all the time in marketing, but without proper context, it's actually pretty meaningless. So today we're going to take a look at the different forms destruction has taken and talk about the impact that these systems have had. We're going to end by looking at the newer methods in Star Citizen called Melstrom and talk about how this changes things. To start off, this is not meant to be a comprehensive guide to destruction in video games through gaming history. Rather, we're going to take a few key examples and use them as case studies to talk about their impact. So to start off, let's talk about Dig Dug. This is a very simple game by today's standards, and it came out at a time when arcades were more common than home consoles. The whole concept of Dig Dug is that wherever the player moved became a pathway for both their own character and the enemies in the level. Level destruction wasn't a feature of the game, it was the feature of the game. It's also the simplest implementation of destruction that we'll be looking at today. There's no physics interactions being calculated here. The interactions that are there are inherently simple, both due to the nature of the game and the limitations of the hardware at the time. In spite of its very simple mechanics, Dig Dug does show us two major impacts that destructible terrain has on players. These are cover and concealment. Cover, in this context, is any durable material between players that prevents them from shooting each other. It does not necessarily obscure their view, but often does. A good example of where it doesn't is the indestructible glass that is present on so many games today. You might be able to see each other, but until you get rid of that window, you can't interact with each other. On the flip side, concealment doesn't necessarily protect the player, but it does hide them. A good example of this is hiding in a bush in a shooter. While the enemy might not be able to see you and therefore won't shoot at you, if they do spot you, you're going to take damage. Except for when the Pukas and Dig Dug start cheating, the terrain is effective cover. Then they turn into Danny Phantom and start chasing you to mess you up. Now we jump forward a bit to the year 2002. Red Faction is a multiplayer game that has destructible terrain and allows players to do all kinds of things that they never could before. You can dig a tunnel to serve as a choke point while you snipe from deep within. You can juggernaut through walls to shorten a capture the flag route. And you can remove obstacles to get behind players and get an advantage. We start to see the real breadth of player strategy that destructible terrain allows. Usually, your environment is a constraint, but with destructible environments, now you have a powerful tool to add to your kit. We see an evolution of these concepts in Battlefield Bad Company 2. A number of significant advancements happened between these two titles. Principally, the hardware available to gamers is exponentially more powerful. As an example, Red Faction was a PlayStation 2 title which at the time had a 300 MHz processor coupled with a 150 MHz graphics processor. If we compare this to the PlayStation 3 with its 3.2 GHz processor and 550 MHz processor for graphics, it's no question that there was significantly more headroom available for calculation for developers and players alike. And it's here we start to see a shift in how destruction is done. Games like Red Faction weren't really doing a whole lot of physics calculations in its destruction, but Bad Company 2 was one of the first games to really push physics interactions as a focus of its gameplay. You weren't simply digging a hole or removing a wall and swapping textures. Now you could collapse entire buildings and watch them fall in spectacular fashion in a physically realistic way. And you could literally drop the ceiling on your opponents and crush them beneath. A question we might have is, if this existed in 2010, why is it that not every game since then has had destruction to this level? Well, while it may be just one of many features for games today, it's one that has the potential to be so fundamentally disruptive that the game literally has to be designed around it from the ground up. The first part of this consideration is, what is it going to add to the player experience? For instance, if you're playing SSX Tricky, you might be able to clip the tops of trees, but if you run into a tree trunk, you're going to wipe out. At the same time, you might be able to discover a shortcut by going through a special grate. This more limited scope of destruction keeps the gameplay intact and prevents players from ruining the flow of a map, and enforces the type of experience the developers were trying to provide. There are examples, though, where destruction was clearly needed but wasn't a consideration by the developers. A very obvious one in my mind is the 2019 remake of Modern Warfare. Nipping at the heels of the once influential Battlefield series, Modern Warfare 2019 was the first Call of Duty game to include vehicles as a major focus of gameplay with its larger ground war game mode. Unfortunately, they only made part of the considerations needed for adding vehicles to their roster. The flow of vehicle gameplay is dramatically influenced by environmental design, and because there's no destruction in Modern Warfare, it makes the pathing for vehicles extremely limited, and even the paths that do exist can be extremely cumbersome. In this case, the answer as far as what it would add to the player experience may just be an easier time navigating maps while in a vehicle. Jumping back to Bad Company 2, it potentially has the opposite problem in that it has too much destruction available to players. It wasn't uncommon to finish a match with nearly every building razed to the ground. This leaves very little effective cover for infantry players and often results in the end of a match boiling down to a game of whack-a-mole. Its successor, Battlefield 3, is in my mind a perfect balance. There is still a lot of destruction possible, but it was toned down quite a bit and meant that maps still had a semblance of flow to them at the end of a match. Map design in Battlefield 3 may have been critiqued at the time, but it would prove to be one of the more successful iterations in the series. There were clearly defined vehicle and infantry zones with enough gray areas between them to allow for creative routing. Still, infantry players would have ample opportunities to hide from tank snipers, and vehicles could also have a chance to get away if someone were walking up with C4. This kept the destruction serving as more of a tool in the player kit instead of a mechanic that could break the game. The destruction also eased the navigation of vehicles that otherwise could easily get caught on indestructible garbage, like in Modern Warfare. This doesn't mean that destruction is required for good vehicle gameplay though. Halo, for instance, has very good vehicle gameplay, but very limited destruction. There are specific destructible items, but these rarely have widespread impact on gameplay except for specific scenarios like zombie maps. What Halo does have instead is wide open skyboxes, pathways, and the vehicles are much more likely to go over things than crash into them. If you try to do anything that's standard procedure in a Warthog in real life, I really hope you have good car insurance. This is important to note because the major design flaw for vehicles in games like Modern Warfare is not respecting their own limitations and how it impacts vehicle gameplay. You don't need destruction if you provide enough space for vehicles, but if you're going to go for more realistic, human-sized proportions, you do need to make considerations for how a main battle tank is going to navigate a crowded main street. A lot of games give their entities different states, such as full health, damaged, and destroyed. Depending on how much damage an object takes, it will transition between these states in an often very predictable way. We see a good example of this again in Halo, where vehicles have spectacular explosions, at least until Halo Infinite, because those ones kind of suck. But if you watch enough of them, you realize that they're all the same. You see the same parts fall to the ground and eventually disappear. The same applies to their destructible objects. A pallet will break the same way, regardless of how you slash at it. Even Bad Company 2 is doing a more advanced version of this same technique. The interaction is more dynamic, players do have more control over how it happens, but once the number of walls reaches a certain threshold, the building will collapse in the same way each time. Furthermore, if you pay close attention, regardless of where on a wall segment you hit it, that wall segment will collapse in the same way each time. As the series has progressed, sometimes these wall segments are smaller, but the overall experience is still largely the same. Another important note to cover is when damage is purely visual. This is present in most modern shooters and is what happens when you shoot the side of a building with your small arms. In Battlefield, small arms usually aren't enough to bring down a wall segment, but if you shoot the wall, you see the impacts of your bullets. These are usually little more than decals in games, and in most cases will disappear after some time. This disappearing act is an important resource saver for games that can't handle that level of persistence otherwise. It's also something that in most cases doesn't negatively impact gameplay, so it's just a smart move overall. If your twitchy players are running around too fast to notice when their bullet spray disappears, then it doesn't really matter that it's gone. Now, as we start to shift gears to talk about Star Citizen's upcoming implementation called Melstrom, I want to first recap some of the main points we've talked about as they'll become important for this discussion. How do you make destruction valuable to players? How do you implement it as a tool? How do you balance it? How does it affect environmental design? How do you account for the resource requirement? And what method do you use to get there? These are all important questions to consider as we look at the future of destruction in Star Citizen. Melstrom is potentially the most advanced implementation of destruction in video game history, if it lives up to its expectations given to us at CitizenCon 2023. It's the first destruction method that I'm aware of in a major title that doesn't rely on generic health pools for destructible objects. Instead, it's using a physical-based simulation rooted in the classic cantilever beam model. This is in just about every engineering class I've taken so far. So many things can be simplified to a cantilever beam that you see them used in many cases to evaluate different kinds of designs. Now, I want to make a more nuanced discussion of material science and physical destruction in a follow-up video, but for our discussion today, I'm going to simplify a lot and focus on only two aspects that are critical to understand Melstrom. Those two aspects are stress and strain. Much more than just emotions experienced by senior college students, in the realm of engineering, these have very important definitions. Stress is the amount of force relative to an object's cross-section. A good way to visualize this is with two sticks. These both come from the same tree, so the material should be basically the same. But just by looking at them, we can accurately guess which will be harder to break. Because the larger stick has a bigger cross-sectional area, it takes more force to break it. The material properties are the same, so the way that we describe these forces with respect to their cross-section is stress. The units of stress are pascals in the metric system, and we're only going to cover the metric system today because while I do live in the land of the free and the home of the brave, our intense loyalty to a dead king's unit really does irritate me. Pascals can be further broken down into newtons per meter squared. So we see by the way that the unit is formed that it's force per area. Strain is closely tied to stress. For any amount of stress, the strain is the corresponding deflection of the object or material. For example, if I apply 1 Pascal to a piece of rubber and a piece of metal, we would expect the rubber to bend a lot more than the steel. This bending is one manifestation of strain. Keep in mind that since pascals are normalized to the cross-sectional area, we could have a thin sheet of rubber and a massive I-beam of steel, and the comparison of pascals takes care of any necessary conversions. So while the ideal scenario would be to compare identical cross-sections, we would find that the numbers work out the same regardless of the shapes and the sizes of our objects relative to each other. Now, while stress has very clearly defined units, strain is a different story. In fact, it's dimensionless or unitless and is often written as a percentage. We calculate strain by taking the object's final state and comparing it to its initial state. A very simple example, if we have a beam of some material that starts at 1 meter in length, and we apply tension to it until it stretches to 1.25 meters, which is the base measurement of an SCU, by the way, we would say the strain is 25%. In engineering, we use something called the stress-strain curve to evaluate materials. There is a lot of information in this one chart, but you'll have to wait for my next videos for a deeper dive. For now, the part we care about is the slope of this initial section and the point where the curve ends. The slope of this section is where the term Young's modulus comes from, and for our discussion today, all we need to know is that the steeper the slope is, the stiffer our material is. Without paying too much attention to any real values, we can imagine that if we plotted our steel and rubber together, we would see a very shallow slope for the rubber and a very steep slope for the steel. And this makes sense because, as we mentioned before, it's a lot easier to bend rubber than it is steel. The point where these curves end is your point of failure. This is where the material has taken all the stress and strain it can handle, and it separates into multiple pieces. This is where the rubber band breaks and you snap yourself in the eye. If we know what this point value is on the graph, we can extrapolate on the other key principle of Melstrom, the cantilever beam. A cantilever beam has one fixed end and one free end. This means we treat one end of the beam as though it has no ability to move. But this is done within a specific frame of reference, and that will become more important in a moment. If we know what the beam is made of, then we can assign a value in the game to represent its failure point or the maximum load that the beam can take. Any force applied to the beam in-game then goes through a skill check. If the force is above the threshold, the beam will break, but if it is below that threshold, it will remain. This characteristic takes the place of health pools and damage states. But another critical detail they do mention in the CitizenCon presentation is integrity. Based on their description, integrity does sound a lot like a health pool. As damage is applied to a section, the integrity will lower as it absorbs that damage. Eventually, if the integrity bottoms out, the section will fail. So how is this different from previous systems in other games? While at the moment we can only speculate on all of this until it's actually in our hands, it seems from my perspective that the difference is in the fact that it's only a section of the ship that will have failed at that point. The ship overall doesn't have a health pool, but much smaller sections of it do in some sense. This is one area where I'd really like to get a lot more clarification from CIG. They showed a lot of Gladiuses smacking things around, but for this video I want to focus on a much simpler example they showed. One demonstration featured NPCs firing at each other with cement barricades between them. We get to watch as sections of these barricades crumble and chip off. Using what we know about Melstrom, I want to take a step-by-step approach in trying to figure out what is going on here. First, we have our overall geometry for the barricade. Then we subdivide this into our breakable clusters and we add some notation for our cantilever beams. It's stated in the presentation that these beams have infinite length. I understand this to mean that these beams extend through other breakable clusters. But to keep my illustration simpler, we're just going to draw them in like little staples between each section. Now, if we apply damage to this top left corner, we can see that the integrity of this portion degrades. Because this section is pretty small, it happens very quickly. If we stop shooting just before reaching the threshold, then maybe the integrity comes back over time like heat dissipating through metal. But if we pass that threshold, the section breaks off. In contrast, if we shoot the next section with a large caliber round, rather than the integrity chipping down slowly, we sever the beams instantly and the section comes off. I mentioned that these cantilever beams are infinitely long, and my interpretation is that they extend through other breakable clusters. So while we've been looking at what happens within the frame of reference for a single cluster, the damage and forces could be propagating through other clusters as well. This would mean that massive impacts affect multiple clusters at a time, and damaging a single cluster has systemic effects throughout the rest of the object. There is a whole lot of speculation here throughout the video. I based all my work on what they've said about this system, but again, I want to stress we won't really know how much of this is accurate until we have it in our hands, or at the very least, CIG does a few episodes on the topic. If this is how the system works for a single cement barricade, then we can scale this up to a Gladius, and they showed the map of one in the presentation. Scaling up again to a larger ship, or a fleet battle, planetary system, and finally the whole universe, this is a lot of data to handle and track. It does give me pause because the lofty ideal of Melstrom has to be balanced against server performance, gameplay structure, and many other things. So you might not ever see a completely destructible sandbox, but elements of it would at least improve the experience. Only time will tell how meaningful these changes end up being and how much we'll see of them in the verse. In my next video, I plan to talk about the other material properties they mentioned in this presentation. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss my future content.